Rangers fans, welcome to season 3 of Liberty Blue, the essential New York Rangers podcast. I'm Andrew Chelney alongside Nick Zararis. And Nick, it is that time of the year again where we do division previews. We will go through a division an episode. And then at the very end, after we've done all of them, we'll cap it off with a full Rangers preview episode. Nick, we started off with the Pacific.
A very interesting division because 3 of the 8 teams are outwardly rebuilding. Anaheim, San Jose, and the Flames. The Flames can tell you it's not a full-on rebuild. If you look at the roster, it's a rebuild. You're going into the season with 2 goalies who have less than 100 career NHL starts. You're going into a season with 4 or 6 defensemen, not proven NHLers. You have a few nice assets, frankly, that you could still trade off and continue to ascend your prospect pool, develop it out. San Jose, they got rewarded for being awful. They got Celebrini in there. They traded for Askarov, which we'll get to. We're going to start with the Sharks in a minute. Then you go up on the other end of the spectrum. You have the Oilers, who look to be pretty stable. You know, they lost some guys. We'll get to them eventually. The Kings have been floating around that middle of the pack for a few years. You said it before we started recording. Still don't have a great read on what Seattle's trying to do.
Yep.
And then you have the Canucks, who very well could be in that Edmonton tier, or they might take a step back and end up closer to where the Kings are. And that's what's fun. And then Vegas, they're in a weird spot right now. This is probably the most bare bones their roster has been going into a season since their inception. They've taken some interesting gambles, and there's a whole lot to talk about. So we'll start in reverse order. We'll go to the worst team in the NHL last year, the San Jose Sharks. Anytime you can get rid of David Quinn, you've made your team better. I can say that authoritatively as a Ranger fan, hand up.
Agreed.
We went from David Quinn to Gerard Gallant, and we were looking around at each other like Gerard Gallant was Scotty Bowman. You know, we were looking around at
comparatively. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, it's all perspective. Somebody who's 6'1" looks very tall to someone who's 5'4". That's the kind of vibes we were going from David Quinn to Gerard Gallant. They have taken their lumps. The Sharks have been an atrocity, for the lack of a better term, for the last few years. They got pennies on the dollar for Erik Karlsson and Timo Meier. They've drafted in the high end of the first round for a few years in a row. They overpaid on free agents to kind of build out some of that roster. So these young guys, whether it's Will Smith, whether it's Celebrini, have guys to play with like Toffoli, like Wenberg. But I think you're still talking about a team that even best case is, the 10th, 9th worst team in the entire NHL. Worst case, they could pick first overall again. It would not be a surprise.
I have, for the pros for this team, this is the Askarov show, the Celebrini show, the Will Smith show, even the Jake Wallman show. I mean, they got him out of Detroit for nothing, and that decision by Yzerman still is very strange to me. But they are clearly better than they were last year. Like, I'm not breaking any news here. These additions have immediately made this team better. Now, by how much comparatively, because of how awful they were last year? I mean, they're going to be better. They're not, I would think that they're not going to be losing 10-2 to teams anymore. Maybe, hopefully. Like that game against, I think it was Vancouver, they got absolutely that was it was so bad that people watched San Jose unironically because they wanted to watch the train wreck. That's how bad it was last year. So by comparison, this is going to be a much better team. They're actually going to have young players on this team that can thrive here. Celebrini and Askarov, who, is a quote unquote unknown at the NHL level, but we all know that he is one of the best goalie prospects in the league right now. Surely he's already won the starter role for San Jose. And this is going to be a project. This is not going to be a team that's going to make the playoffs or come close to the playoffs, for that matter. But it's going to be fun to watch how all the young guns develop. I mean, they're going to have plenty of ice time. They're going to have plenty of leash, you would think, because some coaches that coach bad teams, for some reason, don't give their young guns a leash. And I question those people every day of my life. But hopefully in San Jose that doesn't happen, and Celebrini gets 45 minutes of ice time a game and then just makes a bunch of mistakes early and then figures it out and goes from there. There's not going to be pretty, but it's going to be more fun and more enjoyable than it was.
I think there's a real argument for the Sharks being a fun team, not a good team. I think they're going to skew towards offense. You look at that back end, it's still very light. Jake Wallman, probably the only reasonably dependable defensemen amongst that group. You know, Cody Ceci, if he's your sixth defenseman, you can survive that. Right now, he's probably going to start out the season on their first pair.
Daily Faceoff has Cody Ceci listed as the second defenseman.
Yeah,
which is insane.
You look at him, Jake Wallman is solid. Jan Ruda is probably a fifth or a sixth defenseman that's going to have to play up. Edward Vlasic still hanging around, kind of shocked he hasn't gotten the medical retirement yet that, frankly, all of the guys on those atrocious contracts end up getting. You know, you think about some of the other ones that have happened over the last handful of years, guys who magically develop allergies, guys who magically develop, a chronic injury that can't be treated or refusal to get treated. So I think the Sharks are safely in that bottom third of the league, 10 or worse. I think they have the potential to be fun, especially depending how Will Smith, how Celebrini do out of the gate. If Celebrini comes in and is 60-ish points and that team has an identity going forward, they have a new coach in there, somebody who has been in the Sharks system for a few years, was an assistant under David Quinn. This is a transitionary period. We always talk about you got to bottom out, you got to eventually start making progress. This is the first season the Sharks have actively started building something vertically towards improving. They spent money in free agency. They brought in established veterans. They brought in, our friend Barclay Gaudreau. They claimed Ty Dellandrea. We mentioned Toffoli and Wenberg, Ceci. Those are all pros. Those are all guys who know how to play at the NHL level that are good for your veterans to be around. The big question I have is, how good are any of these young guys actually in the NHL scope? We as Ranger fans can authoritatively tell you, not all these guys are going to hit. You can look at Askarov, you can look at Will Smith, Celebrini, etc. Or even if they're dependable NHLers, if Celebrini's just a 40, 50 point guy as opposed to a 70, 80 point guy, you got to recalibrate what your expectations are. But I think for the Sharks, I'll be curious to see if they can start to take steps. They don't need to be good, but they not be the worst team in the entire league.
I have a pro, I have a con, and I have a question for each team that we're going to go through. And we talked about the pro. The con is, well, the season's 82 games.
Yes.
And San Jose is going to lose a lot of them.
Yes.
I think the biggest thing for them this year is that they are objectively going to be a more fun team to watch. If you are a fan of the team. Now, as a fan of not the Sharks, I unironically tuned in to watch some Sharks games because I knew it was going to be a disaster fire, and it was fun. It was fun to watch from my perspective as a fan of not the team. But if you are a fan of the Sharks, this is now going to be a season that is less horrific to watch. Like, they are objectively going to be a team that, on some nights they could upset some teams because, let's say Celebrini develops into the player that we think he will be. He could score 2 goals. He could score a hat trick, and then he beats one of the best teams in the league because of one of the young guns. Okay, well, that's a highlight right there, and you can build off of that. So I think, they're going to be awful. They're not going to be, anywhere near a playoff team, but they're going to be fun. And the question that I have is the light at the end of the tunnel in San Jose.
How far away is it?
Soon, right? Surely, at least some kind of light. It doesn't have to be, making it all the way to the final, but comparatively to what they've been the last few years, the light is coming soon, right? You would think.
Well, it's funny you say that because the team we're about to talk about has been saying that for probably 2 years now in the Ducks. I cannot say this enough, and it's a real testament to how hard it is to make all the pieces fit. If you look at the Ducks roster, the moves they've made over the last handful of years should have them reasonably competitive. You're going into next year with Cutter Gauthier, Zegras, Leo Carlson, Troy Terry, Mason McTavish as your foundational young guys. That's a really solid group of pieces. And we got to talk about the sliding scale of what are the reasonable expectations for each of those guys. But you have the foundation, whether or not they end up going long with Zegras or if he ends up moving on and they try and recalibrate the team to more of what Pat Verbeek wanted to be, whatever, there is talent on this team. But we all know the reason it hasn't come together is because they have yet to really find a way to overhaul that defense. You will go and look at that back end, and it's hard. I was talking about this the other day on Locked On Oilers, but it's a lot easier to find 12 good forwards than it is to find 6 good defensemen.
Yeah.
By just simple math, when there's only 6, the pool of guys is going to be a lot thinner. And when you're looking at this Ducks team, it's the biggest barrier. Brian Dumoulin had a reasonable bounce back year in Seattle last year on a prove-it deal, but he was playing on a third pair. He was playing with a mobile partner. You look at that Ducks back end, and Gudas is solid. I think if Gudas is your 4, you're probably a little light, but he's not terrible. But the Ducks lacking a true first pair in general, not just one, but they don't have a first pair. And then the goalie situation. I like Dostal. I don't know if the Ducks are going to give Dostal enough run to prove whether or not he's a starter this season, but it's coming together. I like the pieces the Ducks have, but similarly to what we said about the Sharks and what we're going to say about a lot of teams over the next few weeks, until I see you start putting together wins at the NHL level and your young guys start to emerge as dependable pieces, it's going to be hypotheticals. Like I said at the outset, I like the young guys they have. I really like Leo Carlson. I really like Mason McTavish. When Troy Terry was really good 2 years ago, he was great. Last year, not the same. And frankly, I can finish my point on this, they also have to stay healthy. That's been the Ducks' arguably their biggest flaw the last few seasons is Zegras perpetually injured. They gave up on Jamie Drysdale because he just couldn't stay healthy. And they got a good piece in return for Jamie Drysdale, but you got to get these guys in the lineup and they need their game reps. Like we just said with the Sharks, for Celebrini, Askarov, Will Smith, you need your reps. It's not about this year. It's not about next year. It's 2 or 3 years from now, but you got to play for those reps to matter.
One of the pros that I have for Anaheim is that you mentioned him, and I think Dostal is going to be a really solid NHL starter. I think he's one of those goalies that all Anaheim has to do is give him an opportunity to essentially let him go. Just give him a run, which is really difficult to do when you have John Gibson as the second goalie, the 1A, the 1B. They don't really know what John Gibson is. And the problem is that they've tried trading him, and nobody has seemed to want to take on, one, that contract, and two, that health bill. No one really knows what John Gibson is going to be, how many games he's going to play, how healthy he is. No one really knows. So nobody really wants to get that chance, which limits Dostal's potential ice time this year. That's one of the issues with Anaheim. I mean, the other pro is it's Cutter Gauthier's time. Like, that's going to be fun. He's going to be fun to watch in Anaheim, along with all those other guys that you mentioned. I mean, the defense is still a massive problem. But the thing about Anaheim's blue end that I like is you're going to see a lot of their growing pains in real time. You'll see Pavel Mintyukov, you'll see Owen Zellweger, you'll see a lot of these up and coming players that if things go right, that could turn into a solid blue line. If Zellweger really turns into a top 4, maybe even a top 2 defenseman, and Mintyukov the same way, okay, now you're cooking. Cam Fowler struggling. He's getting paid $1 bajillion for a bajillion more years, so moving him is impossible. But now it's up to the young guys. They have a lot of them, and the potential development curve could be really good. One of the issues is, well, how many games is also going to have, and 2, is everybody's potential going to be reached? That's kind of the question that I have in Anaheim.
They have done the work. You know, they're a few years past where the Sharks are. They've spent some money on guys, whether it be Ryan Strome and Frank Vetrano and Alex Killorn. You know, they have spent the money to have the right supporting cast to put these young guys in an environment where they can be successful. And it's not easy to get from where the Ducks were and the Sharks are to competitive. You know, the Sabres and the Senators, who we're going to cover a few weeks from now, they've been trying to do that for 5-6 years at this point. You know, the Sabres drafted Jack Eichel almost 10 years ago at this point. The Senators have drafted in the top 10 more than a handful of times over that period, and they have been unable to get from promising, exciting to actually good. And
Senators also don't know what a good goaltender looks like, which is a big problem.
They've tried, not for a lack of trying. That's the one caveat I would say to that. They have auditioned a lot of different goalies in that spot, and some with more track record than others, but they've tried. They've identified that position as the problem.
We'll get to Ottawa in a few weeks. I just think the one of the biggest problems with Ottawa is they know what they're lacking in, but they don't know how to scout for that problem. Like, giving Korpisalo that mega contract when you know he's not very good is like, I don't understand. But I don't understand that. But you know, we're a little bit away from Ottawa.
I think the one caveat I will say, adding on to that, is goaltending is an environmental position. Unless you are truly, you know, if you're team proof, if you're Shesterkin, you're Saros, you're Hellebuck, Then I think once you start getting towards 6, 7, 8, 9, we're going to get a really good litmus test of this with Olmark, dropping somebody who's been a top 10 goalie for 3 straight years onto a team that hasn't had a top 10 goalie in probably 5 to 10 years. We're going to learn a lot about Olmark and that Senators team based on that. So let's take a pivot here and we can move along to talking about Seattle next. Seattle they are in a weird spot.
Yeah.
Because everybody overcorrected to the Vegas expansion draft where it made Ron Francis's job a little bit more difficult. And then he made his own job more difficult. Like, I understand that they had if Vegas could be competitive right away, so can we thing. And then nobody did any side trades with them. They didn't get any of the foundational pieces the way Vegas did. Wild Bill had 40 tucks the first year that team was in existence. Marcia Show was a 60, 70 point guy that first year. Riley Smith was a 50, 60 point guy that first year. Shea Theodore is a first pair defenseman on that team. And you look at this Seattle team as they're currently constituted, it's fine. It's not bad. It's not great. There's no reason to be excited about the Kraken. They are going to be a very average team. They don't have guys who really have high ceilings to hit. Like, even if Matty Beniers has a good year 3, I don't think he's a point per game dominant forward. I think he's a nice supporting piece to an alpha type player that just there aren't a lot of in the NHL. We're going on year 3 of Shane Wright failing to be a regular NHLer, which isn't just his fault. That's on the organization as well. But you look at the Seattle team and it's very meh. It's fine. They threw a bunch of money at Stevenson and Brandon Montour. That helps. Doesn't make them that much better, but it does help. And that's where you get into the conundrum of spending money for the sake of spending money to tell my owner, hey, we made the team better. We brought in these guys. We're going to sell more jerseys because we actually have guys that people are going to want to buy the jerseys of. And it's hard to be exciting. You're going into another year with Grubauer and Joey Decord. It's really hard for me to see a vision of Seattle as anything more than maybe a second wild card.
My pro for Seattle is Matty Beniers is good at hockey.
Yeah.
He's good. He's going to be fun. And as a first line center, I think he takes another step forward. I do think he really develops into a solid first line center. Is he going to be, a game changing, a top forward in the NHL? I don't know. Maybe I don't think so at this point, but he'll be a really solid 70, 75 point guy, I think, for his entire career. And those are rare. Like, we have to think about it this way. Like, there's only 4 or 5 players in the entire world that can break 100 points in the NHL on a consistent basis. And maybe Beniers does it 1 or 2 years, but I think overall he's still going to be a solid first line center in the NHL. My con is, okay, well, you gave Chandler Stevenson that ridiculous contract. Now what? Because he was really supported by Mark Stone. He was really supported by his cast. Now, I'm not here to suggest that Stevenson's a bad player. He's good. But
it's just a bad contract.
It's a really bad contract. The problem is that Seattle has a lot of pressure to do well this year, but the roster doesn't scream playoffs. And even if they do make the playoffs, they're not a scary team. So ultimately, my question is, who are the Seattle Kraken? Because right now, we talked about this before we went live. Like, you mentioned that they look like, when you make a franchise in NHL, and this is like year 3, 4 down the road, and you're just signing free agents and hoping that everything goes well. Like, that's kind of what this team reminds me of, where they're not bad, but this is truthfully, you take a look at this roster, you tell me that this is going to be a scary team come playoff time? This team? Really? But you have so much pressure to do well. And this is what you got to show for it? I'm not sure.
And the one last thing I want to get in on Seattle, they pushed chips in on this group.
They did.
They gave Vince Dunn a big extension. They gave Matty Beniers a big extension. They are paying Jaden Schwartz and Burakovsky $5.5 million each. You're paying Bjorkstrand $5.4 million. You're paying a lot of guys a lot of money. They have $4,000 in cap space right now. Looking at Puckpedia, you're spending a lot of money to maybe be the 8th best team in the West. Excuse me, not the 8th, the 7th or 8th best team in the West, the entire conference, not just the division. They're going to be in a dogfight. if the Kings regress, maybe they can be past them. But you go look at the Central. Nashville should be better. I think Winnipeg is better. I think you could maybe, I'm not saying definitively, you could maybe make an argument Utah could be better than them. And when you are spending to the cap to this degree, you have spent money on guys in free agency and extended your restricted free agents, and the best you can do is maybe the playoffs, that feels like a miscalculation in your roster construction. Now, Beniers and Shane Wright present the opportunity for growth, which some of the teams we're going to talk about on this episode don't really have, even though they are invested in their team a lot. But it's hard to see where Seattle really makes a big jump year over year. And yeah, Montour's fine. I don't think Montour's a first pair defenseman on a great team. You saw it took Gus Forsling kind of usurping him in that pecking order and finding the right complementary piece in Nico Mikkola to bring out the best in him, where he really only had to worry about moving the puck once Mikkola went and got it. And then Stevenson, as you said, he's not a counting stats guy. You can't be paying non-counting stats guys. And I know that's very reductionist and kind of the antithesis of the analysis we typically do, but the reason counting stats guys get paid is that everybody can look and see why they're worth the money they get paid. When you have to start doing but his goals above replacement and his expected goals, that's fine for 20, 30 games. But 4 years from now, when there are 3 years left on that deal and Stevenson has averaged 33 points in each of the first 3 years of that contract, we're all going to be looking at each other like, what did Ron Francis actually think he was going to accomplish by doing this? And I like Stevenson, the player. When he was really good 2 and 3 years ago, he was one of the best players on that Vegas team. But miles accumulate, hits accumulate. Next up, Calgary Flames, who staved off rebuilding as long as they possibly could.
Allegedly.
Until everybody forced their hand. I think when we talk about where the Flames are at 5 years from now, I think a lot of people are going to look at Brad Treliving the same way we're all looking at Ken Holland right now. He realized he wasn't coming back and kind of threw his hands up and said, whatever. Getting Huberdeau and Weegar as opposed to futures for Tkachuk, giving Kadri that big contract, refusing to trade Hannafin and Lindholm earlier, they cost themselves stuff. And they've accumulated a lot of assets. They have a ton of picks, a ton of prospects. They've acquired something in the ballpark of 10 prospect defensemen in the last year. At least 2 or 3 of those guys should be NHLers. But the Flames are going to find themselves in a position similar to where Detroit is right now, similar to some of these other teams, Seattle per se, that don't have the star. The Flames are going to do the legwork. They're going to take it on the chin this year. They're probably going to take it on the chin next year and pick in the top 5 each of the next 2 years. But until you get that franchise player, that elite first-line player, you are going to be in a holding pattern. And it's the hardest thing to do in this league is to get one of those guys because there aren't enough of them for every team. And then some teams have 3 or 4 of those guys. So the teams that don't, it looks especially glaring. You look at that roster on paper, it's pretty stinky. That forward group is 6 deep, 7 deep.
Yeah. That
defensive group is 2 deep. Their goaltending, they have a combined 80-something starts at the NHL level. There's really no cause for optimism, nor would you want it. The Flames don't want to be a wild card team. They want to stink really badly.
The pro I have for Calgary is that I think Dustin Wolf is going to be really good. I think he's, obviously I haven't watched too much of his AHL games and he's only gotten a handful of starts at the NHL level, but I think he's going to develop into a solid goaltender for Calgary for a long time. It's just the rest of the team is aggressively mid.
Yes.
So mid that if you're a Flames fan, if you're let's say a Flames ticket sales rep and you want season ticket holders, you want people to come buy tickets, who on this roster are you selling? You're selling
Dustin Wolf. That's really
I guess it. You don't build a team just to sell tickets like that. That's kind of obvious, but there's nobody on this team right now that is going to get people in the door. Kadri's a great player. Huberdeau back in Florida was a really good player. He's kind of been aggressively not great in Calgary, sure. Are people going to see Blake Coleman on the opening night roster and say, oh, I have to go because Blake Coleman's playing? oh, I have to go because Kevin Rooney's playing.
Blake Coleman's going to get them a 2 and a prospect at the deadline this year, and he's going to be a good fit for whatever team gets him. You know, you and I over the last 3 years have talked a lot about the sliding doors of 2021, where the Rangers took a long look at him, and was reportedly that John Davidson and Jeff Gorton really wanted to sign Blake Coleman coming off of that second cup that Tampa Bay had won to kind of be, I'm trying to think of what void he would have filled, because that second line right wing spot, you know, if Blake Coleman's playing with Panarin and Strome, that's probably better than what they had the first half of that season. You don't need to trade for Frank Vetrano and Tyler Mott or Andrew Kopp, excuse me. That's who I was thinking of. You don't need to make that trade, but you're probably not feeling as good about it now on the back ends because you probably haven't won, because I don't think Blake Coleman is the difference between that and that. The one last thing I want to get in on the Flames. It does feel like they're going to be in this for a while. I'm not saying it's going to be Buffalo bad, but I think there's a real chance they're not a serious team until that new building opens like 4 years from now. I think there's a real chance where they're going to take it on the chin. That I think Wolf is going to be solid, but it's going to be really hard for him to have a good first few years behind this team. Their defense it leaves a lot to be desired. I do not understand how you looked at Kevin Ball's tape with the Devils, a great possession team, and say that's who we want for Jacob Markstrom. You know, we've watched a lot of Kevin Ball over the last few years as Ranger fans. He's big, but he's not functionally big. He doesn't win puck battles. He can't move the puck. He is the quintessential big guy. He's Tyler Myers, but left-handed. Maybe he can be a little bit better of a skater, and that's the proposition. But if you're that big and you don't have a physicality, a ruggedness to you, I don't understand why you're going out of your way to get a big guy. You know, we're going to talk about Vancouver later, who went overboard in getting big defensemen. Calgary, I get it. Like archetype-wise, you want the big defensive defenseman who can go and get the puck. Kevin Ball doesn't do that. He's just big.
My question for Calgary is what that roster is going to look like post-trade deadline. Because it's interesting to me because, okay, guys like Coleman are going to be easy to trade.
Yeah.
You're going to get like you said, second in a prospect, maybe somebody overpays and gives you a first. If there's a battle for him, you can get, you know, essentially whatever you want for some of these guys. Is Huberdeau still here?
Yes. That contract's immovable.
No one wants first of all, no one wants that contract. Second of all, Huberdeau's drop-off needs to be studied.
I can explain some of it.
It really is. He was such a force in Florida, and then he gets to Calgary, and it falls off a cliff for him almost. Where there's flashes in Calgary where you look and you're like, oh, okay, well, he had a good week or he had a good stretch of games where he's looked really good, and then the next month he's one of the guys on the ice. He is a guy in a jersey who's playing a game. And it's incredibly just weird to think about how just a couple of years ago he was a very dynamic player. Now again, you know, you could argue, he was playing with, you know, other top talents, but what he's had Kadri, he's had guys that also have some of those skill sets in Calgary, and he has been just a guy a lot of the time. And for how much he makes, that's obviously not going to cut it. So it's going to be very interesting to me, because they're not making the playoffs, how much of that current roster that they have is going to still be there come post deadline.
So real quick, I can give you the abridged on Huberdeau. Number one, he's not a strong carrier of the puck. That generally whoever he was playing with in Florida would be the person who would gain the zone, because he's not a great skater, Huberdeau. His best trait has always been his IQ, his ability to move the puck, get it to other places. But the actual mechanics of going from defense to offense, he's not particularly fast. And Calgary doesn't really play that up and down style that Florida did that allowed him to go crazy. You know, we're not far removed where he got third place votes for the Hart Trophy. That year, the year that Florida won the President's Trophy, Huberdeau got the Hart Trophy votes, not Barkov. I don't think we realize that in the moment how crazy that is. But now he doesn't drive play himself. He's a great facilitator, but he doesn't have the skill set of somebody to really drive the game. And because of that, on a team that plays a ton of dump and chase like Calgary does, because they just don't have the high-end talent, he's reduced. He's not going to go get those loose pucks to go get them. His defense has always been bleh, or at best, And when you don't have the puck a lot, you're going to have to play more defense. His counting stats have taken a nosedive. They've more than halved since his time in Florida. And that's because they play at a much lower tempo. They have the puck a lot less. And he doesn't have great players as complements. He's not riding shotgun with some of the best in the world. Him and Kadri, very funny, and I'll wrap up this point. The best that they played, counting stats wise, was the 3 weeks 2 years ago that they played with Lucic, because Lucic had a fluky 30% shooting week where he had 3 goals go in off of him standing in front of the net. It should not be this difficult to get somebody like Huberdeau to produce. I think, if anything, that's a testament to just how important environment is when we're talking about players. Because Huberdeau is obviously talented. You can't do what he did in Florida if you don't have the goods. I think that environment in Calgary, in terms of on ice, I'm not talking about like the morale, the ecosystem like that. Sure. I'm talking about the on ice environment. It's just not conducive to his game. And because he's not playing and he's not being asked to do what he's good at, he struggled massively. Like you said, there were glimmers. Every now and then he whips a really nice pass on the power play. But other than that, it's just very, very unimpressive. I think the Flames won 38 games last year. I think if the Flames win 25 games this upcoming season, I would be surprised. I think they're going to be Sharks, Ducks of this past year kind of bad. It's hard to see a vision for them.
That's a thing that it's going to be a long year in Calgary, because at least if you're now a Sharks fan or a Ducks fan, you have talent to look forward to. You have a lot, Celebrini or, Mintyukov and Gauthier and all these guys. Like, you have these up and coming young, hopeful stars, star players that you want to see. You're in your seat day one. Okay, I'm going to turn the TV on and I'm going to watch Macklin Celebrini, and I'm going to start watching his career and his development, and he's going to be a great player for us one day, right? In Calgary, besides like Dustin Wolf, sure, I think he's going to develop into a good player, but besides him, who is there for Calgary fans to be like, okay, I have to, like, this is appointment viewing, because this is a bad team with nobody that fun to watch. This is going to be a mid team that isn't going to win a lot of games, and there's nobody that is that exciting for fans to want to, should I go to dinner or should I turn on the Flames game? I'm just going to go to dinner. The Flames are going to be boring and they're probably going to lose anyway. That's the kind of year Calgary is going to have. It's going to be a long, long calendar year if you're a Flames fan.
The Flames need to keep turning over that roster. That's the last thing I want to say. You could get something pretty good for Rasmus Andersson. I think you could get a really good, because he's only making $4.6 million against the cap for the next 2 years. I think if you're a good team, like you genuinely have Stanley Cup aspirations, and Rasmus Andersson is your number 3 defenseman out of your 6 guys, I think you have the goods to go all the way. I think Andersson to the right team. And it's funny because I know there was conversation about this during this past season about the Oilers trying to facilitate that. And apparently the asking price was ludicrous intentionally because the Flames didn't want to trade him to Edmonton. I don't know, man. At a certain point, you got to be pragmatic. And if Edmonton's going to give you the best deal for Rasmus Andersson, because they desperately need it, and we're going to talk about the Oilers soon, because the right side of that defense is so full of question marks. Yep. I think you got to look past the Battle of Alberta stuff, especially when you're not going to be in competition with each other. It would be one thing if you were good and you didn't want to trade him in division. If you're going to stink for like the rest of his prime, I don't think it matters all that much. Like, yeah, your fans will give you a hard time about it. Sure. But at the end of the day, if Edmonton's going to give you a 1 and some prospects, you got to do that.
There's a fine line. And I thought you were.
You're right.
I apologize for cutting you off. There's a fine line between no, I will never trade with this team because we're bitter rivals, and stupidity. There's a fine line, because at the end of the day, if you're Calgary and that the Battle of Alberta is essentially going to take a backseat because you're not going to be competitive. The Oilers were just 1 win away from winning the Stanley Cup. You were 1,000,000 points away from making the playoffs, and with no end in sight. It'd be one thing if Calgary just had a really bad fluke year because everybody was injured and they just didn't have the bodies. And then they ran it back and now they're healthy again and now they're making that's one thing. The Flames are actively bad. Who cares about the Battle of Alberta? Like I understand, from an optics perspective, we traded one of our best defensemen to a bitter division rival. But if that's the best offer that you got, and you're not even going to be good, so who cares about the Battle of Alberta? At a certain point, you got to make the trade. If there is nothing better out there on the market and you are actively essentially trying to lose games, you got to make these trades. You have to. Otherwise, you look silly like Calgary does now.
Completely agree with you. I do think that's a team you want to try and trade with, because Craig Conroy has not done a great job of maximizing the value on some of these things. They've acquired a lot of guys. None of them are slam dunks. That's the one thing. And of course, no prospect is a guarantee, but they haven't gotten anyone with a crazy pedigree. They haven't gotten anybody who's closest to a guarantee. And that's the hard part. Okay, moving along, we can talk about the LA Kings next, who, it sounds crazy to say about a team that hasn't won a playoff series in forever. It kind of feels like they missed their window with this group, with that Fiala, Kempe additions to Kopitar, Doughty, etc. It kind of feels like the years for them were 2 years ago and the year before that. You bring in Deneau off of that cup final run he had for Montreal. Their lineup is not bad. It's old and expensive. And those are the two worst things to be in hockey, especially because the guys with upside, like I think Byfield is getting better and that's encouraging, but it's not, we've seen it. It's just not a good enough roster for the playoffs. And look, I understand they're uniquely at a mismatch when they play Edmonton in the first round because of how little high impact talent they have in relation to Edmonton. But if you were going to do it, it would have happened already. I just don't see it happening for this group. They're fine. They're pretty talented. They're like the 14th or 15th best team in the whole league. That's nothing to sneeze at. But if your ceiling is second round exit, I don't know how you as a general manager feel good about that going into a season.
My pros for LA, I mean, Kopitar is still really good.
Doughty's
so is
still pretty
Doughty.
good.
But when he decided to be good again after the team became less bad, Doughty was like, oh yeah, okay, I can try now. And then he did, and now he's really good again. And Byfield's probably going to be even better than he was this coming year. I think he's going to take a step forward. The thing about LA is, well, first of all, you give Joel Edmondson that ridiculous contract to be your sixth defenseman for reasons unknown. I mean, first of all, he's not very good at this hockey thing. Also, gave him 4 years at $3.8 million per year to do what? To do what? What is he do? What is he doing for that cap hit? You could not get that information out of me, possibly. If you came up to me and asked me, I'll give you $1 million if you could tell me why the LA Kings gave Joel Edmondson that contract, I would not be $1 million richer, because I have zero idea.
Because he won a Stanley Cup 5 years ago.
Sure, but tangibly, I couldn't possibly tell you what he does that makes him earn that contract. Now, Joel, go get your bag, bro. You get every penny you can. I'm on your side all day, every day. But if you're the LA Kings, why on earth would you give him that contract? I have no idea. Also, they don't scare me.
No.
They are a team that is compiled of decent guys, especially at the high end with Kopitar and Doughty. They're a decent team. They don't scare me. They're not a team that I would hate to see in the playoffs. I wouldn't are they the best matchup for the Rangers or anybody in the West? Maybe they're better and worse matchups against other teams, but they're not so scary or dangerous that you take a look at the schedule or, you're looking at the playoff tree and you're like, oh man, we have to play LA coming up. That's going to be a tough game. They're good, but they're not a team that you kind of circle on the calendar of we have to watch out for them. They might do a lot of damage this year. They're fine. They're not. They're very meh.
Yeah, it's not a bad roster. Kopitar, Kempe, Byfield, Trevor Moore, Deneau, Fiala. That's a solid top six. Yeah. They replaced Arvidsson with Warren Fogle, who's not bad. They still have Arthur Kaliev kicking around and Alex Turcotte kicking around, who have yet to really kind of capitalize on their potential.
And they got Tanner Jeannot, who the Lightning gave 5 picks away to get.
They're in a weird spot. they're not bad enough to like tell Rob Blake to take a hike, even though that probably would be the right
For the
outcome.
best.
Because he's put together a solid team, but they're capped out. They can't improve this roster anymore, and it's entirely upon their young guys. And look, I love Fiala, and I think Kempe is one of the most underrated players in the entire league. Both of those guys can be 30 to 40 goal guys, but even then, it still doesn't feel like enough. And good on them getting out of that Pierre-Luc Dubois contract. Taking that gamble made sense at the time, but they didn't have the best plan to integrate him into their lineup. He played a lot of third and fourth line, very clearly checked out, and wasn't particularly invested in the outcomes of their season. And they did the right thing there, but you lost your depth and you spent a lot of money losing that depth. You know, you think about what Iafallo probably would have meant to that group, or what why can't I think of Buddy's name on the Jets? This is terrible radio. That was the other person in that trade, who was injured most of last season. Velarde. There we go.
Yes, Gabe Velarde. Yes.
Yeah, that was who I was thinking of. When you lose those two guys, Iafallo and Velarde, for nothing, because you've given up on PLD 1 year into it, it's just not a great look.
They lost a lot of depth in that trade immediately, and I don't want to speak for you, but I know I did not like that trade for LA when it happened.
I thought purely on the gamble, because no matter what, they're kind of stuck in this box. And if Dubois cared, he very easily could be the long-term Kopitar replacement. But it feels like it's going to be a perpetual challenge to get him to the level of engagement and the environment and the right line mates to get him to play at his best. And, you know, we're going on 4 years since his last really good stretch during that playoff run, where they ultimately lost in the first round to Tampa Bay, but they made him sweat, and he was a driving force in that. You know, he was really good in that qualifying round series against the Leafs that the Blue Jackets won. But all of that said, they don't have a lot to show for this window. You know, a lot of teams, they almost stuck the landing in reassembling their group the way Dallas did. You know, Dallas fully stuck the landing, reorganizing around Ben and Sagan. LA almost did it around Kopitar and Doughty, but it's just not on the same tier. They haven't hit on any of their young guys the way Dallas has. Now, if one of these young guys for LA really kicks off, pops off, then it's a different conversation.
Sure.
Moving along, next up, the Vegas Golden Knights. They have won their Stanley Cup already. At this point, it is a matter of how long can they keep kicking the can down the road on having no long-term future. You know, they don't have a pipeline. They don't have a lot of draft picks. You go into a season with Pietrangelo and Eichel and Stone, you're pretty good out of the gate. You know, those are 3 of the 30, 40 best players in the entire world. If everyone's healthy, they will be competitive. They have a solid lineup, but they are also going into this upcoming season with Victor Olofsson, Pavel Dorofeev, Brendan Brisson, and Alexander Holtz in their top 9. And Ivan Barbashev on their top 6. This is the weakest Vegas lineup in a long time.
Easily.
Their high-end talent is great. Don't get me wrong. Eichel, Stone, Pietrangelo, Shea Theodore, that's more than enough to get you to the dance. But you saw it in that first-round series against Dallas. Dallas's depth was enough to mitigate that high-end talent. And when you don't have that enough depth, you have a hard time. You know, there's a reason Vegas has been doing LTIR shenanigans forever, because they know we need to fill out our bottom 6. We need to go out and get that Tomas Hertl. And I'll be curious to see if Hertl really fits, sticks, and coming off of that injury where he missed so much time last year. I'm curious to see what Noah Hannafin looks like in his first full year there. You've got an okay goalie tandem. You know, Aiden Hill was good enough to win a Stanley Cup already, so you have some proof of concept. But I don't want to say Vegas's window is closed. It does feel like it's closing, though. It does feel like they're kind of on the decline.
Yeah, I mean, we have to address Vegas with a little bit of a grain of salt, because again, they've already won.
Yeah.
So all of this is bonus content for them. Like, I understand that the goal is to win every year, but when you take a look at this roster, this is what bonus content looks like for teams that cannot physically replicate the roster that they had to win the Stanley Cup. This to them is bonus content. So yeah, I mean, their blue line is still really solid. Eichel, Stone, still, you know, 2 of the best players on the planet. If Hertl comes back and he's healthy, like you said, I'm interested to see how he fits. I think he does look better than he did when he came over to Vegas, although that's not really saying a whole lot because he looked really bad in Vegas when he got traded. But I would think that he gets better from that. One of the cons, and you mentioned, is Victor Olofsson going to play top 6 minutes? This is the guy that Buffalo just couldn't keep anymore because all he did was essentially just sat pat on the power play. He didn't do a whole lot of anything else. And this is the guy that you want playing second line right wing. This you him of all people. So okay, well, your forward depth is looking a little bleak. Your blue line is very good, but my question is that what if Adin Hill doesn't have great numbers? Because if he doesn't have great numbers, the blue line can still be great. But you're gonna lose games 3-2, 4-2 every night because you don't have the offense to mitigate every other issue. Your offense is not as deep as it was. It's not as strong as it was. It's not as scary as it was. And if Adin Hill is a little bit leakier than during the cup run, well, then what are you going to do? Because you don't have the offense to mitigate that.
It's really a weird spot to be in for them because, like you said, they've already won. They're trying to have their cake and eat it too. They're trying to get another one before they really have to face the music because that's coming. Vegas will eventually have to face the music for being as aggressive in their roster construction as they have. They're going to be a playoff team. They very well could be second or third in the Pacific. If everything breaks right, they very well could win the division outright. But I think the two teams we're about to talk about. So next up is Edmonton, who went to the Cup final, came within 2 goals of winning the whole thing, put even more chips in this offseason. And the framing I want to use to talk about Edmonton is very straightforward. It's very similar to the Rangers' dilemma of we've been really good for a few years now, and the costs were relatively controlled. Edmonton is facing the proposition of going from paying Draisaitl 8.5 and McDavid 12.5 to McDavid getting 15 and Draisaitl getting 13 to 14. Evan Bouchard got 3.6 this past season. On his next deal, which he can sign next summer, it's going to be at least a 7 or an 8. You're talking about playing almost $40 million for 3 guys. There is not a world, and look, I think McDavid very well might end up being the best player to ever play the sport. I don't think you can build enough of a roster if 3 guys are making almost half of the cap. As good as Draisaitl, Bouchard, McDavid are, I don't think it's doable. And then you're still going to have to give Stuart Skinner his next contract. And you're going to have to fill out the rest of the team. They've got Hyman under contract for, I think, 2 more years, and they got Nuge under contract for 3 or 4 more years. After that, Skinner, Henrique, Arvidsson, Perry, Connor Brown, Janmark, all of those guys are 1 or 2 year deals. It very well could be where they can do what Toronto did, where guys like Spezza, guys like Giordano, they'll take the minimum because they want to be on that team. They want a chance to play with the best, whatever. This is it for Edmonton. If they don't do it this year, they are going to have to, by definition, take a step back because they cannot afford the roster they're going to have. They're going to ice next year. They just can't. The math doesn't work. Maybe if the cap goes up to like 110 as opposed to 104 going into from next summer to the year after, okay, maybe. But that's banking on a lot going right. And as we always talk about on this show, hoping for things to go right is not a plan.
The pros for Edmonton is, well, the boys are back in town. McDavid's back. Draisaitl's back. Nuge is back. Like they're all the top guys, and Bouchard is back, and Skinner's back. Like all the guys that made it back to the final, they're here again. And offensively, they did get better. Like Arvidsson is a solid player. Jeff Skinner is offensively a solid player. Even Podkolzin could be something for Edmonton. The problem is that their blue line, besides Bouchard and Ekholm, is definitely a collection of human beings that play hockey. I'll tell you that. Like their blue line is just not great. Darnell Nurse making $1 bajillion to be what we all saw what he was in the playoff. I'm not very good at this hockey thing. Like this is a team that is really going to leak a lot of opportunities. And the question that you have to ask yourself is, yeah, Jeff Skinner is a good offensive player, but because he doesn't back check ever, that by default means is that the blue line and also Skinner Stuart Skinner, are going to have to make up for a lot of those chances going the other way. Jeff Skinner is obviously not going to play a perfect season where he never has one turnover or or one shot that rings off the post that goes the other way. He doesn't play any defense, which puts a lot more pressure on everybody else to cover for him. And when you have a blue line that has two guys that can play defense, both of which play on the same pairing, if they're not on the ice, that is going to lead to a lot more problems. So the question that I have for Edmonton is, are you going to be able to win every game 8-7? Because that might be what you have to do.
It feels very it's showing a lot of hubris to think you're going to get by till the trade deadline with Troy Stecher and Ty Emberson as your 2 and 3 right D. Stecher hasn't been a full-time NHLer in a while. He hasn't played more than 50 games in a season in a few years now, and especially not on a good team. He's on Utah, he's on the Flames, but neither of those teams, well, Utah now, Arizona then, but not particularly good. And Ty Emberson has 20-something career NHL games. You are asking a lot of either of those guys to say, yeah, you're playing with Darnell Nurse. We know it's not going to be easy. Good luck. It's asking a lot of either of those guys to do that. And you're going into this year where you're going to ask Skinner to start 50 to 55 games, and you're going to need 25-ish from Calvin Pickard. That is a lot for a backup who hasn't had to make that many starts the last handful of years, frankly. The Oilers will be fine in the regular season. That's never the problem with them. They're very similar to the Rangers in that regard. We've talked about it a lot where because they're so successful in the regular season, it's hard to tell people in that organization, you guys aren't doing a good job here. Because on paper, the Oilers will win 50 games. They'll be the first or second team in the Pacific. They might have home ice. They might be able to win the Western Conference as a whole and have home ice the whole way. But you get to a playoff series against a team that plays fundamentally sound 5-man defense like the Panthers do and did in the Cup final. That transition offense, the life's blood of how the Oilers like to play, it's not there. You need to be able to cycle to maintain offensive zone time, especially with a defense that's going to be this fragile, where if you force Nurse and Stecher and Kulak and Emberson to play a lot of defense, you're going to be able to take advantage of them. The Oilers' defense was the reason they lost the Stanley Cup final, and it's worse than it was going into. And I know people will say, well, they got rid of Cody Ceci. He's not very good. Cody Ceci is not very good, but I at least know what he is. Whereas with Emberson and with Stecher, I don't know if either of those guys can be 20 minutes a night and penalty kill. That's another thing. You lost Desharnais and you lost Ceci, who both killed penalties. Stecher hasn't killed penalties in a few years. And Emberson, killing penalties on the Sharks is, I don't want to say rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, but I don't think the expectations for the Sharks penalty kill are comparable to what you're going to ask him to do here in Edmonton. And you would think, as bad as the Sharks were, we couldn't get this guy in more than 20-something games last year. It was because everybody talks about...
Well, that's David Quinn special. You know that.
He was good in the AHL from what everybody who's written about him tells me. If he was good in the AHL, why couldn't he get in on a team that won 19 games last year? Especially on a defense that's terrible. It's concerning. The Oilers are staking a lot on their guys, and you can't bake Anaheim and giving you 50 again. You're probably not going to get... actually, no, I take it back. You probably are going to get 150 points from McDavid, but at some point, the math starts to become too fragile, and it becomes too... you're depending on too much going right as opposed to having an actionable plan.
To a certain extent, I'll disagree with one point that you made, and that's, you know what CC is, but I like the thought process of let's try somebody young and new who might be bad.
And he's cheaper.
Cheaper, as opposed to somebody who's older that is more expensive and is bad. Like Cody Ceci is actively a bad player in the NHL. He's just a horrific defenseman. He doesn't defend, doesn't skate all that well, and he's definitely one of the people in the NHL for sure. That is confirmed. So the fact that you remove it from your roster, and your replacements are complete question marks. You have no idea if Troy Stecher can handle top 4 minutes, and oh, by the way, your partner is Darnell Nurse, and also Ty Emberson, a guy who, like you said, couldn't get on a really bad Sharks team. Now, how much of that was on him versus how much of that was David Quinn? Because we all know that David Quinn has has had a tendency to do that over the course of his coaching career. We don't know for sure, but I at least like the idea that Edmonton is going for with this blue line. Yes, there are question marks. We both are not very high on the blue line much at all, but I like that at least they realized, oh yeah, Ceci is not an NHL defenseman. We got to get rid of this guy if we want to win the Stanley Cup. Okay, so we got rid of him, and now Stetcher's a question mark, Emerson's a question mark, but they could be okay. They could be. I would rather this plan of, well, they could be, as opposed to, oh, well, we know that CC's bad, but we have to play him anyway because he's there. Like I like this plan more than the same team, but with CC.
Fair enough. All right. They won the division last year. They made some interesting roster decisions. The Canucks, after several years in hell, trying to recapture the magic they had in the bubble 4 years ago, they finally broke through. They made the playoffs. They won a playoff series. They very well could have beaten Edmonton in the second round, and I think they would have had a reasonable chance against the Dallas Stars. They did lose some pieces, but they bring in Vincent Desharnais. They bring in Derek Forbort. They bring in Jake DeBrusk. It is a reasonably talented team. You have the reigning Norris Trophy winner. You have a goalie that, if he's healthy, and Demko right now is not in line to start the preseason.
Yep.
He may or may not be available to start the regular season. But when Demko's right, he's a fringe Vezina candidate. You have Elias Pettersson, who can go over 100 points. You have JT Miller, who can go over 100 points. You had Brock Besser, who went over 40 goals last year for the first time. This is a good group. I think they're probably the second or third best team on paper in the Western Conference. I think they are a fringe Stanley Cup contender. I think my biggest question for them is their defense actually good? Because when you look at it and you kind of squint a little bit, it's a lot of size, but other than Quinn Hughes, there's not a lot of puck movement going on back there.
This is a team that is going to win a lot of regular season games. They're a team that offensively got a lot better. I do like Jake DeBrusk's fit in Vancouver. I do think he's going to really round out that top six. The one question I have for the top six is Daily Faceoff right now has Daniel Sprong listed as a second line right wing. That's a kind of guy that hasn't had a lot of top six runway. He's gotten points, but there's a reason that he only kind of gets these 1 year low salary types of deals, because teams like to date Daniel Sprong, but they don't like to marry Daniel Sprong. It's the same way with Gustafsson that the Rangers did this past season, where when he's good, he's a solid part of the team. But oh man, when he's not, he's just not, he's actively hurting the team. And some of that could be what's happening with Daniel Sprong. So I don't really know how long Sprong is going to be listed there. And if he's not the second line right wing, say that 3 times fast, then who is? That's going to be a tough spot. And the blue line, again, yeah, like you said, Quinn Hughes is fantastic. Okay, now who's going to play? Philip Hronek got overpaid. I mean, he's good to a certain extent.
I think he's a 3 or a 4, not a 2.
He got overpaid. Quinn Hughes did they're a great pairing together, but Hronek without Quinn Hughes, not that sensational. And then you go down the lineup and you say, okay, well, yeah, there are a bunch of guys that are genetically gifted with being taller. Okay, but can they defend well? Can they retrieve the puck? Can they move the puck? Can they break out of their zone effectively? I don't really know what the answer to that is. I'm not super sold on that blue line. And my biggest question is, what is Demko's health actually?
He's been really hurt over his career. This is not a new thing. He's missed a lot of time over the last handful of seasons. And look, Shelov's was a very fun story in the playoffs. I don't know how realistic it is to say, okay, it's your team right now, to somebody who has 5 career NHL starts. And it's a tall ask. Goaltending is really one of the defining benchmarks where you don't need to be elite, but you need to be consistently above average. You need to be in that 12 to 10 range to be consistent and to have your team good enough. Because You look at what happened to them 2 years ago, the year where Boudreaux gets fired and they bring in Tocchet midway through the season. The goaltending was off a cliff. Demko was coming off of an injury. He wasn't fully healthy, and he really struggled. And the same thing happened the year before when Travis Green got fired and they brought in Boudreaux midway through the season, where the goaltending was not playing well, and it got him fired. And goaltending, and we're allowed to say this, good coaches don't tell the goalie make more saves, okay? A lot of people misconstrue this. Every coach tells their goalie, hey, you need to make the save for me. That is not the difference between a good and a bad coach. Rick Tocchet did not magically get Demko to make more saves. He was healthy. The team played better. He had a lighter workload. Okay, let's get out of here on this note. Give me the teams in the order you think they're going to finish in, and then we can call it a day.
I think the Canucks are 1.
Okay.
I think the Oilers are 2. I think Vegas is at 3. LA at 4. Seattle at 5. Anaheim's at 6. Calgary at 7, and San Jose is going to be at 8.
Okay. I have slightly different. I have Vancouver, Edmonton, Vegas, LA, Seattle, Anaheim. I have Calgary, then I have San Jose. But I think
is that not what I said?
No, you have excuse me. I have Calgary last, not San Jose. That's the one difference we have. Okay. I think Calgary's going to get their teeth kicked in this year. I just think it's going to be really difficult for them to be competitive. I think Edmonton is bona fide cup contender. I think Vancouver and Vegas are fringe contenders. I think the Kings are a playoff team. I think Seattle is a fringe playoff team. I think Anaheim is 8 points back of one of the wild cards.
They're getting there. They're moving in the right direction, just not fast enough.
I think the Ducks are like 83, 84 standings points. I think they're like 10 points off of the last playoff spot.
I think if they play their cards right and they really build off of this year as the development year, they could be a potential wildcard team next year.
That I think is reasonable. I think Calgary is going to be in the low 70s. I think the Sharks are going to be in the mid to low 70s in standings points. Those are two rebuilding teams. The Ducks are probably the highest. Actually, no, Seattle's probably the highest variance team in this group, where if things break right for them, like it did 2 years ago, they probably could make the playoffs. Or if it goes like this past year, they will not make the playoffs. But I do think that will do it for this week's edition.
Before we go, we got a really nice comment that I would like to read out loud. It's from Dimitri on YouTube. He said, "Love your podcast. Keep them coming. Looking forward to your in-season work as well." And Dimitri, we thank you for listening. Thank you for everybody that has ever tuned in, listened, or commented or shared. We appreciate you dearly. And Nick, tell them where they can find all of our stuff.
We're on all the major podcasting platforms. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please throw the show a 5-star review. It helps other people find the show. If you're listening over on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button, hit the alarm bell so you get a notification whenever new content goes live. We're getting there. We're over 600. The subs have slowly but surely been ticking up. Leave us a comment. Let us know the order you think the teams are going to finish in the Pacific Division. We will talk to you guys next week, where we will hit the Central Division. Talk soon.
Later.